of information. Ooh. Okay, I'm glad.
Sorry, you asked me to record it a while ago, so I just wanted to.
Yeah. Okay, that's
I apologize.
Fine. No big deal. Anyway, so the information density is incredible for DNA. We've really got a huge amount of information packed in there. Now, hold on a second. Someone might say, all right, well, hold on. If I have 3 gigabytes and I get my DNA from my mom and my dad, and they both have 3 gigabytes, if I got 3 gigabytes from mom, because that's what she has, and 3 gigabytes from dad, because that's what he has, how come I don't have 6 gigabytes? Shouldn't I have 6 gigabytes? Well, if I did, and then my wife has 6 gigabytes and I have 6 gigabytes, wouldn't our kid have 12 gigabytes? This is not going to work, right? The DNA is going to grow geometrically until it explodes and takes over the whole earth. So how does that work, right? You say, how does that work? Well, that's why they color coded these differently, because in this picture, one color is your chromosome set from mom and one color is your chromosome set from dad. So from each parent, you get a full set of one copy of chromosome 1, chromosome 2, chromosome 3, chromosome 4, chromosome 5, and then you get the same thing from your mom. That's why you have 2 copies of every chromosome. So if we look at that, that means that we have something like this, where the sperm, it's called haploid because it only has 1.5 gigabytes of DNA. Egg cells only have 1.5 gigabytes of DNA. Put them together, you get a diploid zygote that has 3 gigabytes of DNA, and that's what leads to us. So that's how that works. Okay, but that has some odd implications when you think about it. It means that, obviously, right, we each have 2 parents, mom and dad, we have 4 biological grandparents, we have 8 biological great-grandparents. So the numbers really go up. And when you think about the way this doubling goes with the geometric sequence, it really goes up fast. Here's my family tree. You can't see everything because it's the print's too small, but you can see 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. And so it goes, just going back one generation, maybe 20, 25 years, and you double every time. That goes up really fast. So if you go back a little ways, say just a few hundred years, you have hundreds of grandparents, then thousands, and great grandparents, ancestors. And that means that if you go back maybe only 1,000 years, it's really not that long. 1,000 years ago, maybe the 11th century or 12th century or something like that, you get over 1 billion ancestors that are your ancestors, your great-great-great-grandparents. And if you think about it, you think, hold on a second, that doesn't make sense at all, because the whole population of the earth at that time was only a few hundred million. How can I have so many ancestors when there's not nearly that many people on the entire planet? It's because we're double counting people. One of these people, like let's say this person over here, is your mother's father's father's mother, mother's father, father's mother. And this other person here is your father's 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 mother's father, father, father. So because of that, because that gets interwoven, because it forms a network more than just a straight tree, it means that if you go back far enough, and it's really not that far, mathematical models predict it's only maybe a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen thousand years ago, everyone alive on that earth at that time is either your ancestor or they have no ancestors, no descendants alive today. In other words, their line died out. One of those two. That means that if we go back to that point, or anytime before it, 5 million years before it, 100 million years before it, then your ancestors are exactly the same people to the person as my ancestors. And that's true for anyone on earth. Incredible to think about that. That has a name that's called the identical ancestors point. To go before that, all our ancestors are exactly the same people to the person. Now, kind of hard to deal with all those big numbers. I want to point out that that's not as hard to imagine as you might think. If you go on Google Maps and you try playing around with it, you'll find that you can walk all the way across the earth in about a year. Now, that's walking every day and not farming or trying to get food or all this kind of stuff. But the point is that when we're talking about dozens of thousands of years, right? I mean, the pyramids were only like, a few thousand years ago, right? If we go back to the pyramids or before, it would be very easy for people to find each other and to have these kind of biological connections. Now, I know there's some isolated populations, it might take a few more thousand years to reach into there. But the point is, when we get back a few dozen thousand years to the identical ancestors point, we all have exactly the same ancestors. Okay, one other implication of these very large numbers, and this is another one that's kind of really hard to understand. Think about this. Obviously, we just talked about how your mom has 3 gigabytes, your dad has 3 gigabytes, so that's a total of 6 gigabytes of DNA in that gene pool, and you've got 3 gigabytes. 6 in the gene pool, you have 3, right? There's 3 gigabytes that you didn't get. Now, your siblings might have got it if you have a sibling or something like that, you don't know. But the upshot is that you only get half of the DNA from your parents. And if you go to your grandparents, each of your parents only got half. So that means that from your grandparents' gene pool, all, 4 of your grandparents, you total up all their DNA, you only get a quarter of it. Only an eighth if you go to your great-grandparents, a 16th. That means, this is going to sound very paradoxical, but if you go back, the farther you go back to your ancestors, maybe a few hundred years ago, you get almost no DNA from any one of those ancestors. And in fact, from some of them, none, because it's all been lost through that same process. Nearly all of your ancestors don't give you any DNA. What? How does that happen? Right? Because it's only a very small fraction that makes it through each of those steps. Each step only has a 50-50 chance of making it to the next generation, ignoring evolutionary selective effects. So with that, let's take a short break, maybe 4 or 5 minutes to relax, maybe, make sure your brain doesn't hurt or something like that. And maybe, grab some water or something like that. Hope everyone has a fun time. 5-minute break and we'll start again. Discussions. So we'll move ahead with some of the ancestry compositions. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to be looking at a number of these. What these are the chromosomes. Each pair, you can see there's 2 bars up here at number 1, 2 bars at number 2, 2 bars at number 3, right? Because one of those is from mom and one's from dad. And they have adjusted the color in each section according to where the ancestors are probably from, where that DNA probably came from. So I'll get into how that works right now, and we'll take a look at it. It's amazing to think that you can get this level of detail, all these little sections of, each chromosome, to find out which one is from someone in Finland and which one is from someone in Africa and which one is from someone in, India or something like that. So let's take a look at that. This is my sister, by the way. I don't have the exact same ancestry composition as her, of course, because like I said, we don't have exactly the same DNA, but I have a lot of similarities. We do have in here, okay, so this is the way it works. Let's say that you, zoomed in really close on this one section on the upper bar of chromosome 7. So one of your copies of chromosome 7. And until we test your mom or dad, we won't know if this is from mom or this is from dad. There's no way to tell that. But if we test mom or dad, then we can see which one has the same information and say, okay, now we can go through each of them and say, this one's from mom, this one's from dad. That process is called phasing. So if that's been done, we say that the DNA has been phased. So let's say that we have this, we look at chromosome 7, we zoom in to just a few base pairs in there, and we see A, T, T, G, C, C, A, and say, okay, so let's take a look at some reference populations where we've gone and tested, people, hundreds and hundreds of people in, let's say, Great Britain and looked in this one small section of their DNA and said, what sequence do they have there? And then we do the same thing, maybe over in Beijing. And then we do the same thing with hundreds of people in, let's say, Cape Town, South Africa, or something like that. And by doing that, we build up reference populations, which are made up of thousands of individuals in most cases, not all. Sometimes it's less than that, depending on which group you're talking about. So then we say, okay, here's what we get for people in Italy, and here's what we get for people who are from China, and here's what we find when we look at people in Africa. And so we look at that and we say, oh, let's take a close look at this one right here, this one base pair, and say, oh, look, it does not match. Those two, it matches Italian. So from that, we would say, this is probably from an ancestor from Italy. Maybe going back a few hundred years before you started to get a lot more mixing of DNA as travel increased. So with that, we would color this section a light blue for Italian DNA, and we would go on and do the rest of your whole genome of your 23 chromosomes. Now, these are the colors that are used by 23andMe. 23andMe is one of the biggest DNA testing companies. They're very good. They have their stuff rooted in science very well, and I highly recommend them. They're quite affordable. Ancestry.com, also very good. I am not going to throw any aspersions at Ancestry.com. They're very good too. The only reason that I'm focusing on 23andMe in this talk is because for 23andMe, you get these nice colors that paint out your whole genome, whereas Ancestry.com doesn't quite do that. It's a really neat way to understand your ancestry composition by chromosome. So, in fact, as you saw, by time scale, space scale, much smaller than a chromosome. These are the shadings that they use. They use purple colors for Africa. They use blue, shades of blue for Europe. And they use shades of orange and yellow for Asian DNA. Now, I want to point out something here. You can see that over here in the Americas, they've marked everything out with Asian DNA. What? Why, right? Because Native Americans are Asian. They came across from Asia through the Bering Strait, and before that, probably by boat. We don't know for sure, but we do know that people were in Americas over 20,000 years ago, and that their DNA matches up very well with Asia. And there's other things that confirm this time and time again, that that Native American DNA is a subclass of Asian DNA. So let's take a close look at a few examples. So here, as I mentioned before, this is my sister, and we look at the colors here and say, okay, what colors are there? Well, of course, almost all European. You can take one look at me and you can figure that out. But we did have some surprises. There's a couple places in our family where we have African DNA on chromosome 3 and chromosome 15. I have a chunk on chromosome 15. And it turns out that that's only from my dad. My mom does not have any African DNA left in her genome that we're aware of. And we also have two little pieces here that are likely Native American DNA. We knew about that. We knew about that from our family tree. And it was not a surprise at all to find that that comes from my mom and is not present in my dad. So let's take a look at some more. How about this one? Anybody want to tell me where they think I might have gotten this sample from a friend of mine?
Sorry, what was your question?
Anybody want to guess? Anybody want to guess what ethnicity this person probably is? This is a friend of mine.
Black guy?
What their ancestry mostly is.
Sub-Saharan?
Yeah, mostly sub-Saharan Africa. And more specifically, this is a very common distribution you would see for African Americans in the United States. And for African Americans in the United States, you usually have between 40 to 75%.
Middle Eastern?
no, 40 to 75% African. Austin, you got that? There you go. Yeah, just mute everybody, I guess. So, and you often have between 10 and 60% European. A lot of us are familiar with the history there. I don't need to get into that, I don't think. And surprisingly, a lot of people aren't aware that there's almost always some Native American. Because when the Europeans got here, the first thing they did was they enslaved a lot of Native Americans and built labor, plantations and things like that. It was only after they realized that there weren't any more Native Americans to enslave that they started to get Africans and bring them in and mix them in with the slave population at the time. So because of that, practically all African Americans today have significant Native American ancestry. And for most of them, this shows up in their DNA. Again, as I mentioned before, your ancestry, your total ancestry is a lot more than just what shows up in your DNA, because most of our ancestors don't give us any DNA. All right, I mentioned chromosomes. Now all these chromosomes have genes that do things. Otherwise, we would, we would have a big biological problem, right? So, so here is a map of some of the things that the DNA does. For instance, the gene that controls male pattern baldness is on chromosome 1. Some of the ones that control how tall we are where these rulers are, right? Chromosomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can look at your DNA and say, oh, where are the ancestors that are giving me things that are useful here? And so I look at my dad here. Here's my dad's DNA. And I say, oh, what about this little bit of Scandinavian? We can see that on chromosomes 13, 21, and 22, and 5. And we say, oh, what are some of the things that are being done there? Oh, 21 and 22, here's the gene that causes us not to have gills like fish. This is the gene that mutated many hundreds of millions of years ago to allow us to not grow gills. And it's there on chromosome 22. My dad can thank his Scandinavian ancestors for not having gills anymore. And similarly for controlling motion during sleep, there's several genes that do that. Another one from his Scandinavian ancestors. So this is just fun. There's a lot of places you can look at this. Another example of fun stuff with DNA. We hear all the time about fun DNA solutions to questions, especially in police work, right? In this case, Hank the Tank was a giant bear. You probably saw this. This just happened in the last week. This bear has been breaking into houses and breaking stuff inside and eating food and all this stuff. Everyone was all worried about Hank the Tank over in the tower. What are we going to do? Well, they started doing DNA tests on scraps of fur that had been left behind, and they discovered that no, he's a whole bunch of different bears. They're just all calling a bear Hank the Tank if it breaks in. That's a fun story. Here's another ancestry composition. This one here is from a friend of mine from Hungary, and this person just their parents came right over from Hungary. They have not been over here in the Americas for long. The family's not been here long at all, and so they don't think they would have any Native American. But we saw this Asian DNA. What's going on? Well, anybody who knows history in that area of Hungary knows that when Genghis Khan took over a large part of the area, a lot of the population now is descended from Genghis Khan. So this friend of mine is named Connie, C-O-N-N-I-E. I think that I mentioned to her, maybe we should just call her Connie, C-H-A-N-N-I-E. And we take a look. This is a friend of mine. This is a friend of mine from Turkey. And this is a Jewish friend of mine who has a lot of Ashkenazi Jewish. This is there's a bunch of markers here in green that are usually associated with Europe's Jewish population, and also plenty of Middle Eastern DNA, as you would expect, right at the border there in Turkey between the Middle East and Europe. So very interesting to see how these things break out. Here is, this isn't a close friend of mine, it's more of an acquaintance, but she was really interested to get her DNA tested because she has, you can see from the DNA right here, one parent that is from Beijing and one parent who is American. And it shows up very clearly in the DNA. And each time they've got one copy of a chromosome that comes up solidly East Asian and another one that comes up solidly European. Also, another thing you can notice in here is the fact that you can tell the gender of the person right away by looking at the DNA. Obviously, the friend I just mentioned here has got 2 copies of the X chromosome down here, and the other friend of mine from Turkey has only 1 X. So, moving on, now that it's safe to do so, we have another friend of mine wanted to get her DNA tested, and just because a whole bunch of us were doing it. Like I said, I've been involved with hundreds of people who've gotten their DNA tested, and this person is just, as far as they know, standard European. Don't expect anything interesting in the DNA, but it'll be interesting to see how much of it is, German or French or British or Irish or something like that. Well, we got the DNA back, and the DNA doesn't lie. This person has very significant African American ancestry. Probably to the tune of a great-grandparent, maybe, or something like that. We don't know. There's not any huge mystery in the family tree, but we don't have a huge amount of information in the family tree. But obviously, someone quite recently was a very significant African American in this person's family. So this one here, if we look at this one here, there's several things that jump out at us. We see Spanish, a lot of Spanish, a lot of Native American, and a good chunk of African too. This is a very common breakdown, a very common setup that we see with people from Mexico. So a lot of people from Mexico are very significant Native American, and that's something that people forget when they're talking about immigration things. These are mostly Native American people by ancestry. So with that, I'll mention one other one, a friend of mine who expected who looks as blonde hair, blue-eyed, completely European by looks, but said she has significant Native American. We got her DNA back, and yes, she sure does. No question about that at all. So with that, I've had a chance to take a look at these, and I know it's been a little bit fast, but I invite everyone to just take a minute to relax. We'll go into a short guided meditation and a chance for us to just think about all of our ancestors. We've seen plenty of stuff from other people's ancestors now, but what about ours? So I invite you to relax, sit comfortably. Let the cares and concerns of your day fall away. Be here now. If you like, you may want to close your eyes or just focus on the candle. As you relax, you begin to free your mind to think about your ancestors, to think about maybe your parents and your grandparents. You knew them looking as older people, but they were young ones too. Think of them as teenagers or as children. What would they do for fun and games? Maybe outside or by a river. What was their life like with no internet? Now, look farther back, maybe to their great-grandparents back at a time when people didn't know for sure that they would be safe from diseases like polio. Back at a time when we didn't have modern dentistry with anesthesia. Back at a time when people worked hard to make sure there was food on the table, as many do today. If we keep going back hundreds, thousands of years, the mist clears and you see before you, through the woods and branches, a Stone Age village. You hear the people talking. They're your ancestors. They're talking about how one of them was just elevated to elder status and now commands more respect. They're talking about what game they might be able to get in the woods in the next few days. You look around the village and realize that everyone in this village is either the ancestor of everyone alive on earth or of no one. From there, from that connection to all humanity, come forward, back towards the present. Only a few centuries ago, to people that are your ancestors and not the ancestors of everyone. Where are they? Are you looking at a town in Syria or Spain? Maybe Native American ancestors? You probably don't know their names after hundreds of years. But now you can see them. You see a building. As you approach and open the door, you see a young mother nursing a baby. It comes to your mind that that baby is your great, 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 great grandparent. The mother looks up to see you. What would you want to say to her? Spend a moment to feel the family connection, the gratitude, and the love. We'll take a few seconds for that now. And now, say goodbye. You feel the pull of the present. You're coming back to today. You feel the years slowly move past you, slowly at first and then faster. 1842, 1880, 1909, 1947, 1976, 1994, and today. You are drawn back to your chair. You feel the chair under you, the warmth of the room around you. You see the candle flame. Welcome back. And with that, we have a little bit of time for questions and comments.